Mervyn, I am so glad that I finally get to speak to you. I look at some of the statistics. I saw the UNICEF report in 2024 references about 23% of South African children suffering from severe hunger. I look at our own statistics in South Africa, 13.2 million living in extreme poverty. And most recently, when we were discussing the economy and the budgets, about 19 million, if I'm not mistaken, South Africans that are literally struggling in South Africa. 80,000 new grant applications received. What is happening in South Africa, Mervyn?
So, Lynette, it's really a very sad situation because when we look at our food security as a country, so we test food security at two levels. The first level, of course, is the national. Does South Africa produce sufficient food, both for its own consumption as well as for exports? And of course, there it is yes. The answer is unequivocally yes. We produce sufficient food for both consumption and for export. But when we look at household food security, that is where the difficulty is. And that is where we have something like 45% of all South Africans are in one way or another suffering from food insecurity. And perhaps the real saddest statistic that seen recently is that about 1,000 of our children had died out of illnesses directly associated with undernutrition. And we suspect that that is just the tip of the iceberg, that the problem itself is greater. And so we have to ask the question why. And the question
Mm,
why is quite complex, but at its heart, it is the level of poverty. We access our food by and large through the market. And in order to access that food from a retail or store or elsewhere, we need the level of income. So, food prices versus the levels of household incomes, what we call
mm.
affordability, that is the main cause of why most South Africans are struggling to put sufficient and nutritious food on the table. If I could just give you the stats from the
Please do.
Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group's Household Affordability Index. So for the month of May, the 44 very basic foods that we track. So these would be foods like maize meal, rice, potatoes, onions, 10 kgs of frozen chicken, a little bit of peanut butter, 25 loaves of bread, a little bit of spinach, a little bit of beef, etc. So it's that type of foods that we track, 44. And the cost at the end of May of that basket, on average across the country, was 5,466 Rand. Now, that's a 46 Rand increase over the month of April and 136 Rand increase over the past year. So that's the pricing. So when we look at, for instance, household incomes, then we see that the national minimum wage, and we know that about 60% of South Africa's workers earn at the level of the national minimum wage. So that wage would have brought into the for a worker at the end of May something in the region of about 4,800, perhaps up to 5,000. Now, when you deduct transport and you
Mm.
deduct 350 kilowatts of electricity, then what you are left over with is something like 2,113 Rand. Now you divide that by 4 persons, and then you arrive at a figure like 528 Rand, which is way below the food poverty line. So it's that relationship by and large that shapes this level of household food insecurity, and of course the difficulties that pose both from a health, a social development perspective, but also for an economic perspective. Because
Yes.
let's face it, um, 25% of our children under the age of 5 are stunted due to the fact that they haven't received sufficient nutrition in the early years. So all the kind of educational input that we give those children through no fault of their own, well, we won't get the benefit of that investment. And when those children enter the labor market at age 22, 23, they are more likely to enter the labor market as laborers. They will have
Mm.
great difficulty maneuvering this new world of work, AI, IT, etc. And they will earn too little to feed their children. And that's where this intergenerational poverty traps seems to continuously impact on South Africa. And the root of that really is the inability to access sufficient and nutritious food. And so food must become one of the basic areas that we have to sort out in South Africa.
I want to quickly go back to those children that you referenced earlier. Are those reported or unreported deaths?
So those 1,000 children, that was in answer. That was the Minister of Health answering a question in Parliament. And the minister was referring to stats of about 2 years ago. So it's probably stats of 22, 23.
Mm.
And unfortunately, the Department of Health doesn't have more up to date statistics. But it is an official statistic that was given in answer to a question in Parliament. So we can take that as an official statistic.
But if you look at at the 2024 UNICEF report, that would make sense because a lot of those kids literally fall by the wayside because of hunger, because of poverty, and because nobody is taking care of them, nobody's nurturing them.
Yes. So, I mean, we must also remember that we come from a history, a very traumatic history. When we look at particularly the areas where there are the largest amount of household food insecurity, so we're looking at rural areas, we're looking at provinces like KZN, Eastern Cape, there are immense traumatic history, whether it was in the period leading up to 1994 and the level of violence and the amount of people
Mm.
killed. And then, of course, soon afterwards, we were hit by HIV and AIDS. And that pandemic took away, so many of our adult people. So we have that trauma that we are still dealing with, and so we have a lot of children who are actually just falling through the cracks, either because they
Mm.
are being reared by grandmothers who are actually too old to rear children, but are trying their very best, of course.
Yes.
Um, and so we're dealing with all this kind of historical social issues that are also impacting and also making this whole issue around child nutrition and feeding children and ensuring that there is sufficient food even more complex and even more difficult.
Has these social grants alleviated some of these issues or not?
So social grants have been the one area that has kept South Africans alive in many
My
ways.
word.
So the social grants play an immense role. We have the stats that shows that social grants have not narrowed a little bit the inequality levels in South Africa, as well as providing some level of income where there is absolutely no other forms of income. Of particular, the child support grant has been a great help in alleviating or bringing down the level of child poverty and child hunger. The
Mm.
difficulty, Lynette, is that when you look at a child support grant, for instance, then whilst it is absolutely useful and helpful, it is too low in terms of its rand value to be able to
Okay.
provide the food that is required for a child. So the grant is somewhere at 630, I think. I don't have the exact rand value in front of me. But it costs about 900, just over 900 rand to feed a child between the ages of 0 and 15, a wholesome meal for the year. So the child support grant is set just that much, that little bit too low. And that has been
Mm,
the reason why we have been campaigning with others in the civil society sector to say, let us peg the child support grant at the level of the food poverty line. And the food poverty line stands at 796 currently. At least then we can be sure that children have access to sufficient food.
mm. If you look at what's happening in all our provinces, give us an overview. You were the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group. Give us an overview of what's happening in households across South Africa. You've now highlighted the cost of buying nutritious food, what those social grants, what impact it has. But then you add to that rising costs in terms of school fees. Water uncertainty that we've seen, electricity, load shedding, all of that compounding. And then, of course, just the cost of food. Give us a sense of what you see on the ground happening.
So, what we are seeing on the ground happening is that households are struggling, correctly, as you say, to pay these essential services. I'll come back to it in a minute. But what we are seeing is that households are buying the barest minimum of food. So they would invest in 30 kgs of maize meal and eat maize meal, for a number of days a week. Of course, which is not nutritional. It fills the stomach, but it's not nutritional. It doesn't have the diversity that is required of the human body. So we are seeing households who are living off maize meal, who are living off just potatoes, and by and large, just starving. I recently spoke to a woman and she said it's absolute luxury to have 2 meals a day. You have to decide whether you have breakfast or whether you have supper, but we cannot afford to have both. And so that is the reality for many, many households. And Lynette, the situation is made worse by the high cost of electricity, water, so municipal administrative costs.
Yes.
Um, because what we are seeing is that households have to somehow get some form of electricity. So electricity is not just because they need it for food preservation, and of course they also need it for cooking, but it's also
Mm,
for household security. In a context where a lot of women live by themselves and women-headed
true.
households, they require that as a form of security. So they would spend the money and buy some electricity. And because the electricity increases are like 10%, 12% this year, uh, it narrows the amount of money that is left over either after the wages come in or the social grants have come in order to be put aside for food. So it's not only just the escalation in food prices, even though that, of course, is an issue. It is also that all these other administrative prices, particularly
Mm,
water and electricity, are taking so much from the household budget, leaving so little money left for women then to go into the stores. And when we look, for instance, at our basket that we track, our index, So about, we've identified what we call core foods. So it's about 16 foods that women say they must buy. These they buy first. And we see that that has increased by almost 200 rand over, sorry, about 100 rand over the last year,
Mhm.
whilst the national minimum wage has increased by just over 200 rand over the last year. We have also seen electricity prices increase. We have seen water prices increase. So it's just impossible for the lower income part of our population in order to be able to survive and live, not even in we're talking about just basically to live
Really.
with the basic necessities of life, and
I,
that
I
has
want
become too difficult.
so I want to get clarity on what these women say. What are the essential foods that they must buy? Give us an idea of that, and also what are the choices that they face. You said earlier you can't have the luxury of two meals. Often it is either breakfast or it's supper, but not twice a day that you eat. So I want to get and give the viewers a sense of understanding the challenges of those very poor families in South Africa.
So the kinds of foods, of course, it's also determined culturally, but the kinds of foods that people would always say they have to buy is either maize meal or rice. That's where there's a cultural difference. Potatoes, onions, a little bit of spinach, bread, peanut butter for the children, polony for the children if they can afford that, and then a cooking oil would be another part of that, and then some stock or some soups in order just to cook a stew and to give the stew some flavor, particularly if there is no meat.
Meat.
If they do buy meat, it's generally 10 kgs of frozen chicken pieces, um, or it might be 1 kg of beef, which is then cut up and a little small portion each used each night in order for the just to flavor the stew. And it's because they have to stretch this food over such a long period why
Mm,
electricity becomes so important, because if you don't have a fridge you can't do that. um,
absolutely.
and that's why electricity prices and when we increase electricity tariffs, it has a direct impact on how much food people can buy. But it's
Mm.
generally that type of food. So maize meal or rice, potatoes, onions, stock, a little bit of soup, bread, a margarine, peanut butter, or polony for the children's lunches.
I- Is there access, or can they afford fruit and vegetables, or is that not even a question? It just does not come into play when you shop.
So it depends. So, and that is why this core foods that I've just mentioned is so critical. Because the women
Mm.
say they will go into the store and they will purchase those foods first. Depending if they have some money left over after those 16 foods have been bought, they will then start looking at other kinds of vegetables and fruit. So they will then look at spinach. They might buy some carrots or perhaps a couple of tomatoes. And they might buy some apples or oranges for the children. So it's really dependent on the cost of that core foods. If the price of
Mhm.
that core foods become affordable, then we will see greater diversity on the plate. And that's the interlink between those two things. But Lynette, there is another a factor that contributes to that. So more and more women tell us they prefer to buy some of the vegetables and fruits from informal traders. So those selling at taxi ranks. And the reason why they would prefer to buy there is because if they need 2 tomatoes, they can buy 2 tomatoes. If they go
Yes.
into a retail store, you have to buy 1 kg, 2 kg, 3 kg. So they can stretch the money a bit further. But then we often have the problem around municipalities and municipalities not supporting the informal sector. So
Yes.
I've been with some informal traders who say, well, we can't get a license from the municipality. We have to stand in the queue for hours or days. When we do go on the street without that piece of paper, they come and they just take all of our goods. We don't have insurance. We don't have savings.
Mm.
That's our business gone.
Yeah.
So we have to think broadly and we have to be innovative. We have to think, how do we get the flow of food through our cities? How can we support the informal trading
Mm.
sector? Because that actually also helps to diversify the food supply in low income households.
Well, I'm just thinking whilst you're talking that what often also happens in those smaller communities and within the informal sector is that because you are familiar and you know the buy on the corner or the spaza shop, you can buy on tick, or you can say, I'm going to take sugar, bread, or rice, or fish oil. And at the end, when I get paid, or I might be a domestic, when I get paid, I will square you, I will come and pay. That kind of relationship is built because you have no other way within the neighborhoods and the suburbs as well, that you go to the auntie because that's how we help each other out. That is the only way you can survive.
Exactly, Lynette. That is the only way most people survive. So when you speak to, for instance, older women who draw, for instance, the old age pension, and you ask them, well, how do you spend your pension? They will always say they have to go and settle their debt first. That is one of the first things they do, because later on in the month, they're going to have to go and buy on the book, as they would say, because that's their lifeline. That's the only way they can survive and come get through a month, and so
Mm.
that becomes a critical area. So it's what we call the kind of community solidarity, where your small business person, your informal trader, but also your small grocer, acts in solidarity with you, and help you out. And actually, that level of solidarity uh, is the means through which, in the lower income sector of South Africa, people still survive. That's the only one. And of course, also in terms of going to your neighbors when you have absolutely nothing, um, and the neighbor helping, because the neighbor remembers that he or she was in a similar situation a year or two ago,
True.
and so that solidarity exists, and because that solidarity exists, we need to find innovative ways to build on that kind of solidarity, because that is a good thing,
Mm.
this kind of support of one to the other.